All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, July 14th. And I will start you off with this. I was just thinking, what if we find ourselves in an actual war with a country like Russia and China? We've just been engaging in these proxy wars. God forbid this happens, but we are kind of pushing for this. It sounds like we're getting closer and closer
Yeah.
without fully committing, but can we conduct a full scale war? Is America capable or NATO capable of actually engaging in an actual war with a country like Russia or China or, I mean, even Iran?
Um, Clearly, we're not capable of conducting a war of attrition. Our military is designed for short and easy wars. Really, it's basically what we saw, for example, in the Iraq War or the first Persian Gulf War. They're short and sweet. We can release a barrage of missiles. And then, when the opponent is not a peer opponent, like Iraq, um, we can destroy them in short order. And we don't need the strategic, the strategic reserves. We don't. It doesn't ever become a war of attrition, and we can declare victory and have our parades at home and tie our yellow ribbons and all the things that we do. But in a war against Russia or China or even Iran, it'll be something different. It'll become a war of attrition, and we're just not set up for that. We just don't have the stockpiles as the administration recently admitted, and then is trying to kind of backtrack. But I think it's clear, even from the actions that have followed that declaration, it's clear that we just don't have the stockpiles. So yeah, we would be in real trouble. The only, the danger, of course, is we could go nuclear. And we can fight that kind of war, but so can the Russians. They have even more nuclear weapons than we have. The Chinese don't have as many as we do, but they have more than enough to destroy us.
Is Do you think going nuclear, do you think that's actually really an option? Because it seems like what you're saying is we can't engage in an actual war with a superpower unless we go nuclear. So
Yeah, it
what
seems
game are we playing then? What game
yeah,
are we playing?
right. Yeah, it seems impossible. I don't see anybody pressing the button now, for example. But when, wars lead to completely unexpected outcomes, or what they do, war has its own logic that takes you to places where you don't want to go. Um, Leaders, governments, entire peoples become desperate, and they entertain possibilities that maybe they never really entertained before. And one of those could be nuclear. I mean, it's just like the thought that, oh my goodness, we're going to lose this war. America can't lose a war. This is not possible. We have to do something. We'll go nuclear, but not fully nuclear. We're just going to use some tactical nuclear weapons. And then, but then the other side responds in kind, and then you go up the escalation ladder. God forbid that'll happen. I don't think it will, but it's just, it's the reason why we shouldn't even have this proxy war, because that is possible. By crossing these red lines, this could become more than a proxy war. It already is, in a sense, more than a proxy war, but it could, our involvement could become even more overt and direct, and then we could find ourselves in a situation like that. Again, that may be, unlikely, very unlikely, but still it's possible. And that's just because the consequence is just so horrific. We shouldn't even risk that, no, risk that outcome, however unlikely.
If you're saying that, it's clear that if we go to a war of attrition against a country like Iran, and no way Russia or China, that we couldn't conduct this war. It's not feasible, and that's basically just from open admissions of our own officials and the fact that we're having to scale back on just supplying the proxy. Then is it fair to say that the U.S. isn't really a superpower then? If it can't go toe to toe with the other superpowers, then you're not a superpower, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, again, we are a nuclear power, so we could destroy the world. I guess that
Well,
makes
so
us
is
a
North
superpower.
Korea. So
Yeah.
is
Well,
Pakistan, India. Do you call those superpowers?
no, they don't have the kind of arsenals that we do. But
Or
um,
Iran is a
yeah,
middling power, right? If we're saying that we
right,
can't engage in a war of attrition with
right.
Iran, I mean,
With Iran, I think probably not, but maybe we could defeat them just with our navy there. And in the end, also Iran can't hit our homeland. Um, so and maybe eventually we could defeat Iran, but it would be very costly, extremely costly. And I think, that's again the reason that the Pentagon has been so reluctant to become involved in a real war with them. Um, there's certain things that the U.S. has. Again, what they don't have is this ability to engage in a war of attrition. They have power projection capabilities that the other superpowers, let's say Russia and China, do not have. The Russian and Chinese militaries are set up to defend their homelands. That's mainly what they're about. The American military is designed to project power. That's why they have these aircraft carriers and fleets. Now, we've talked about the vulnerabilities of all these, and a very large air force. Again, but you're right. When it's effective against weak adversaries. It's quite effective against weak adversaries.
well,
But even then, you're right.
the
Yeah, the
Houthis,
Houthis.
right?
You're right. You're right. There is a problem. Maybe maybe I'm being a little bit too uh,
Generous.
yeah, generous. Yeah, exactly about the U.S. Yeah, I see your point. Right. There are obvious weaknesses. We can do a great deal of damage to many countries around the world. We have this power projection capability. We do have a lot of missiles, Tomahawk missiles. We have a lot of bombs, those ones that were dropped on the nuclear facilities. We have a large air force, a very large navy. Um, but again, it's really for those. Well, like this recent uh, operation that we carried out against the nuclear facilities. Even it's very questionable, whether that succeeded, but at least on one level it succeeded. They got to the sites, they dropped the bombs, and they came back, and they were safe. We're good at things like that, but that's not really a war, right? That's not a war. That's an
And even
operation.
then, okay, what we had 20 of those bunker busters, GB-57s, and we used 14, is what I heard. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's what I've heard.
so
I that
and
may
and
very well. That's probably true.
so that's not a victory, in my opinion, if you had to expend almost 70% of your stockpile, in one go. But also, I'm just a little fishy about that whole thing. I feel like there was some coordination because it sounded like there was, no anti-aircraft abilities being used at all over Iran. And from my understanding, do we know if Israel was flying over the sky, over Tehran or whatever? Were they actually in the airspace there? I heard that in some regions, I think they were, but is
Yeah,
there any clarity?
there are claims. You heard that really in Western media, and the Israelis claimed that they were dominating the airspace, but there isn't the evidence. If they had, you would think they would show you video footage taken from these planes. The only video footage they've shown is actually from drones. So they had these surveillance drones and predator drones that were invading not Iraqi, but Iranian airspace, and did a fair amount of damage. And some of them were shot down. The Iranians managed to shoot some of those down. But I think there was only one geolocation of a manned aircraft, a manned Israeli aircraft within Iranian airspace, and that was very close to the border. It's actually, I think it was at the coast, and they just actually went over the land very briefly and went back out over the sea there. That's my understanding. I haven't seen any proof otherwise.
Yeah, my theory is that the Iranians knew that, okay, if we did even shoot down one of those B-2 bombers, like that would be that could be horrific because the U.S. could just go ballistic, could go nuclear when there was something like that happens. It's so embarrassing. So they just understood, okay, let's evacuate, get everything out, give them their win and end this thing. Maybe that was the
Yeah,
kind of what
well,
was
I find that
coordinated.
very believable. It's not impossible that they even coordinated.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe they didn't coordinate. They just expected it to
Right.
happen. They decided, okay, we'll just let it happen, and we get our stuff out of there ahead of time. Because they clearly did not want to have, bring the U.S. into the war. Maybe in the end, they could defeat the U.S., sink the ships and so forth, and the U.S. would run out of missiles just like Israel was running out of missiles. But it would be, devastating for Iran. Let's be honest. They would suffer, the Iranian people would suffer greatly. So it's something that they wanted to avoid. Um, I find that believable. Maybe they knew it was coming. They decided, hey, we're not going to even try to shoot down a B-2 bomber because that will be raining on Trump's parade. He'll be furious and he'll come in, with everything he has. Now, interesting, they had the you could say choreographed retaliation. They fired the missiles at the base in Qatar. And the initial reports were, let's see, all of them were shot down, or maybe one got through, but it did insignificant damage. Maybe just hit, some um, empty part of the base, and nothing to report. But recently, photos have come out, and it shows that actually significant damage was done. There was a radar dome, I think they call it a ray dome. You've probably seen pictures of these things. They look like giant golf balls.
Mm-hmm.
They're major installations, and one of those was destroyed or at least seriously damaged. And then, and apparently another radar too, a very expensive one, was destroyed. So that it looks like it appears, I'd heard about the radar dome earlier. I just saw a report about a second facility. So, I don't think we can confirm it, but at least one very important piece of equipment was hit, and it looks like a second. And, more than equipment, we're talking about major installations. So it looks like one or two missiles got through and did, very serious damage, in spite of Iran letting the Americans know ahead of time what they were doing. So, they
Right.
had everything. The air defense was all set up, ready who knows how many missiles they fired, interceptors they fired to bring down the Iranian missiles. Yet it looks like one, probably two, got through and did very significant damage.
Yeah, well, that just kind of hammers home the whole point we're making about, this power projection of the United States that you were talking about. It's actually more of a liability. It's a power liability. I mean, having all these expensive aircraft carriers out there in the ocean that can get hit, that had to run from the Houthis from Yemen, and then all these bases in the Middle East to project power. Is it really projecting power? I mean, it just, they seem like tripwires. They seem like liabilities. It sounds like just a disaster for the United States waiting to happen. And this just goes.
I think it is. One of these days, one of those ships is, a major naval vessel, American naval vessel, will be sunk, and that's going to be an eye-opening experience, and maybe even a whole fleet. Like if we get in a war with China, for example, they've got a lot of ship-killing missiles. They've been preparing for this for decades, and they really have the capacity, I think, probably to just take out the whole fleet. Um, yeah, that might just be the end of the American empire if that happens. But it could even happen in the Persian Gulf, like we were saying.
I just wonder why it's so difficult for these realities to get through the heads of our politicians. I mean, we're just observers of this, and it's very easy to be able to see the huge flaws in the United States military-industrial complex, coming from open admissions of our Pentagon officials, from the head of NATO, Mark Rutte himself, admitting that, yeah, we just can't keep up. But we still engage in this very sort of bombastic, threatening behavior constantly with people, but we can't back it up. I mean, everything, even when Iran told the US where we're going to strike, throw you some softballs, you just said they still got through. So why do we keep on engaging in this behavior when these hard realities are very apparent, at least to us? We're just saying that we can't engage in a war of attrition. We don't have any option except going nuclear, but we constantly are antagonizing and doubling down on these proxy wars. And I don't even know if we're capable of waging proxy wars at this point.
Yeah, well, it's a very dangerous situation. I think somebody else used this this analogy. It was, I think it may have been Larry Johnson, but I think it's a good one. We're sort of like a prize fighter past his prime, meaning that, okay, he had his glory days. He was, the welterweight champion or the heavyweight champion of the world at one time, but he's 20 years past his prime, and he just can't accept that. He's still living in the past, and he's making the same kind of bombastic threats, things that he could back up, and he's not willing to recognize that time has gone by and that there are new challengers have arisen and that he really should not get in the ring again. But he just doesn't see it. He just refuses to see it. That's almost seems like I think a fair description of Western governments, the Western political elite. Which, as I've said many times, they just seem like they had that unipolar moment, and they just can't let go of it. But that's past. It's just we're living a new reality, new technologies. A new balance of power. We're not the omnipotent force that we once were. Nowhere near it. And they just can't let go of it. Again, you do see more realism, I think, almost always coming out of the Pentagon and other military departments. That's often the ones that where you actually get the occasional realistic statements, like with this recent statement about, hey, our stockpiles are down at critical levels, and we just really have to stop sending pause the supply of weapons in these certain categories to Ukraine. That came from the Pentagon. I mean, there's no question about it. There's some sort of debate about who it was in the Pentagon that was mainly behind it, but it came from the Pentagon. They know what they have and what they don't have. But the civilians often, this has always been true. They just, they live in this kind of inhabited a different world, and they don't recognize limits. They don't recognize physical and technological restraints. They just have there's this sense that they've been imbued with, since probably their youth, that we are, our power is unlimited. And that's maybe what drew them in, towards the pinnacle of the political system. He wanted to become president. He wanted to wield that power. And so when you get there, you don't want to be the guy that is known for, okay, yeah, it's over. The party's over. We're going to have to retrench. We're going to have to pull back. It's a new era of limits. They're just not, they don't have those kind of personalities, and they can't accept that new reality. So they try to, again, each one of them wants to be the new Winston Churchill, but they really don't have anything to back it up.
You think that's what Trump is now thinking, that he's fallen for this peace through strength? And it seems like Lindsey Graham has become his foreign policy coach, and he's telling him to get back in the ring, Trump, this guy was around Trump, during the campaign, and I was always worried about him. You had a mix of these neocons and actual America Firsters, and it just seems like the neocons just won. I don't know how they just was. It seemed like there was a real battle that first month or two, and then Graham comes out on top. I actually have a clip from Graham. I don't know if you've seen this, but it encapsulates what we're talking about pretty well. Let me play it real quick.
But the game regarding Putin's invasion of Russia is about to change. I expect in the coming days you will see weapons flowing at a record level to help Ukraine defend themselves. I expect in the coming days that there will be tariffs and sanctions available to President Trump he's never had before. I expect in the coming days more support from Europe regarding their efforts to help Ukraine. Putin made a miscalculation here. For 6 months, President Trump tried to entice Putin to the table. The attacks have gone up, not down. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest miscalculations Putin has made is to play Trump. And you just watch. In the coming days and weeks, there's going to be a massive effort to get Putin to the table. And to those who are helping him, China buying cheap Russian oil and having no accountability, those days are about over.
Is he okay? What do you think? Is he the foreign policy coach for Trump?
Well, unfortunately, it looks like it. It looks like, which is something that I think we pretty much expected. Yeah, there was those moments of hope, especially in the first couple of months. But I think they were inevitably headed for that. One thing is that the um, though there was an effort to redirect American policy to adopt a new course, it wasn't based on reality. The problem was that Trump had unrealistic expectations. And so it was a ceasefire. He really wasn't listening to Putin. Putin and all high-ranking Kremlin officials had been saying for months and months, for over a year now. He wasn't listening to that. He just, I think, unfortunately, he was getting bad information, and a lot of it, from his advisors, probably from Fox News, and so he thought that, okay, again, I think in the last program I mentioned, it was the New York Times had a piece titled "Putin Messed Up," which is essentially what Lindsey Graham is saying. That's the consensus. That's the establishment consensus. Everybody from the New York Times to Lindsey Graham is that, yeah, the Russians are desperate. They're in a real serious fix. We've really damaged them. And Trump was giving him an offering a ceasefire. Now, of course, the Russians gave their reasons again and again and again why we can't accept a ceasefire like this. There have to be certain preconditions, they haven't been met, et cetera, et cetera. They were ignoring. They're just so sure that that's the situation. And Trump, based on that false reality, was pursuing this impossible course. It was bound to fail. And when it failed, as it has, then all these neocons have been waiting and say, see, we told you. Now we have this is what you got to do. And it looks like that's what's happening right now.
Right.
Yeah, today, Trump is supposed to give a speech. I think, in fact, Lindsey Graham was actually talking about, it may have been in that same interview, or it may have been elsewhere, where he said, yeah, the speech will be about imposing sanctions. It will be about increasing the flow of weapons. It'll be, it'll be about basically, though they're pretending that it's something different, it's just returning to Biden's policy. It's going to be Biden 2.0. They'll say, but we're a lot tougher. But okay, you can pretend you're tougher and use tougher rhetoric, but you have even less to play with than Biden did. They're just the stockpiles are depleted. There's really not a whole lot they can do.
Right. Trump always tries to give off this image of being strong and decisive, but he's actually incredibly wishy-washy. He's not decisive at all. It's, right. He changes. I guess he's decisive in the sense that he's always making decisions that are contradicting each other. But yeah, it's something that I was just thinking about was that how you said we create our own reality. This idea. Who was it in the
it was Karl Rove
Trump days?
The George W. Bush administration. Yeah, George W. Bush.
Right. Okay. Just how we can create our own reality. But it looks like, we're still trying to do that, but we're looking like a mental patient because we're the only people living in our reality and everybody's outside looking at it because we don't create the reality for the world anymore, but we still act like we can. And we're just creating these fake narratives. Like you're saying, this New York Times post or what Lindsey Graham's saying, they're still trying to do that, trying to create their own reality. And they're the only ones living in it. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, no, it is a big problem. I think it's true that we really have become a victim of our own propaganda. We are very good at creating these alternate realities. We have a very, very powerful, propaganda machine. If you want to use our influence on the media is enormous within the English-speaking world and with the Western world in particular, and it does extend beyond that. It's obviously losing its influence outside of the so-called, rules-based international order, but there still is influence out there. So we can, and I think maybe over time it's just like that as you can see for the Ukrainians too, it just becomes that information war, that the narrative becomes even more important than the reality. That's where they live. That's what's on TV, and that's sort of, to them, it seems, to so many of the political elite, that's more important than these boring statistics about the number of interceptors or whatever. Oh yeah, don't bore me with that. I know that we're awesome, and that's what we've made clear again and again. So let's just continue to be awesome.
Do you think it's what we're seeing is something maybe similar during the Soviet Union in terms of the information space, that they're constantly issuing this propaganda and falling victims to their own propaganda? Are there parallels there that we're becoming like that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's probably true. Again, I've commented on how things have really changed. It's just like, I do remember those old Soviet days, and nobody was worried about the effects of Soviet propaganda. It was pretty powerful within the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Bloc, but even there, I think as time went by, there was increasing cynicism. But it did have its effect there. From the outside, we just tended to laugh at it. It was like, because it was just so blatantly false. Now, you get all there's this hysteria and this fear of, Russian talking points and Russian misinformation, and we got to shut down RT, and we got to shut down Sputnik. And there's this constant fear, we can't have people actually watching Russian state media or getting their information from Russian state media, because, they won't believe us anymore, essentially, is what happened. Yeah, because the thing is, things have changed. It's just that the Russians, by and large, I don't want to take this too far because they're capable of lying too, but by and large, they can reality is on their side. And I think it's true for the Chinese too. By and large, it's true. So they don't have to lie. They just have to report. And we have to lie. And when you're basing your policy on lies, then you got to work really hard to keep reality out. So prevent people from getting finding alternative sources of information. It used to be not the case. We really didn't have to work that hard. There was some American propaganda. It's not completely black and white, but it is. That's pretty close to what's happened. There's almost been a complete reversal.
Well, reality is an unstoppable force, so it's going to win, right? If we don't have reality on our side, then you're screwed.
Yeah, right. In the end, it's just like, it's information victories, like in whatever. They don't win wars. In the end, it is what happens on the ground, and that's what you see happening in Ukraine. The Ukrainians do things again and again so they can get that kind of that high of some sort of media victory, something they can report, and it'll appear promptly in Western media. The Ukrainians did this incredible thing, whether it's Kursk or whatever. In the end, it's insignificant or it's disastrous, as it was in the case of Kursk. But for a few days, and sometimes for months even, they have a something that they can feed the Western media and all the grim reality that the boring lava flow continues, but that's not reported. And if you're just an idle kind of undisciplined consumer of news, you get the sense that Ukraine's scoring victory after victory, but it doesn't add up to anything in the end. That doesn't win you the war. All it does, it does do something, and that is it helps convince influential people in the West that the cause isn't hopeless, and they won't pressure you to go to the negotiating table. If it just became so obvious that Ukraine doesn't have a chance, they might start to there may be more and more Western leaders, maybe not, but maybe more and more Western leaders would start approaching Zelensky and say, hey, this is over, man. You just have to accept your losses, talk to the Russians and work out a deal. But, by playing this propaganda game, yeah, he's losing the war, but he at least can maintain this fiction of a possible Ukrainian victory down the road until the very end, and then doesn't prevent him losing the war, but he can at least the money will continue to flow and the weapons will continue to flow, but in ever smaller quantities.
Yeah, the Ukraine war just feels like a more and more of a horrific, evil grift that is just grinding Ukraine into the dust, and just to keep people's pockets filled and keep them in office. Yeah, do you think that when the Soviet Union, do you think that the fact that it was kind of denying reality and that's why it collapsed, and that's kind of what we're experiencing here? Because a lot of what you were saying is that how their propaganda wasn't effective outside of the Soviet Union, but within the Soviet Union it was working. But even then, there was coming through, and that just was kind of thing that's similar to what we have. NATO is kind of like the Soviet satellites. This is our Soviet bloc, our freedom bloc, whatever we want to call it. But they within there, the elites and certain people buy the propaganda, the reality, but our propaganda isn't effective outside of that sphere. And even within that sphere, there's a lot of dissent. I mean, people like us, there's a lot of popular shows out there. People realize a lot of people like Tucker Carlson or whoever, these are big mainstream guys. I mean, mainstream in the sense that so many people are plugged into them. Right. So is it kind of that's what's happening, that Soviet Union was denying reality and it eventually collapsed, and now we're at this point where we're denying reality and we're just feeding lie after lie to try to keep this grift going?
Yeah. Well, that's possible. There's, I think towards the end, the people in those countries were becoming increasingly cynical. They knew that they were being lied to. I think, the awareness of that fact just grew over time, and that's something that ate away at the foundations of the Soviet Union. And then the people in charge knew that things weren't really working, and they didn't have the ideological fervor that they once had. They did in their early years as a revolution, and then I think just the victory in the Second World War also gave them a big boost for decades. I mean, it was an extraordinary achievement, and it's something. But then as time went by, it's clear that the system wasn't working, and I think that everybody knew it in one form or another. And it just became like, to keep your job or to keep out of trouble, you just lied. Now, you say here in the West now, it's it's different. It is similar in some cases. You really can call the Western European, or all the European states, the NATO members, as like vassal states, but the control isn't quite so open or harsh. It's softer, but it's there, and it actually is becoming increasingly harsh, and harder over time. That we've seen these direct interventions in elections, and of course there's Nord Stream. There is a hard edge, let's put it, to American control, and also to the control exercised by the elites within these countries, and that hard edge is becoming more apparent over time. Now it seems at this stage they're still ideologically zealous, but I think that over time that's going to start to fade, just as it did in the Soviet Union, as it becomes increasingly clear that the program really isn't working. I think that's already started, but we have a ways to go. We still have a lot of true believers at the top, and I think less so among the common people, but there's still a proportion of people that really, really do believe in the leaders, maybe, but more out of probably inertia, just out of habit. There was a time when the West was by far the most prosperous and the most desirable place to live in the world. There was a time, especially you go back to just a few decades ago, and it still is. Like Europe in general is a desirable place to live, but it's on a downward trajectory, and other countries are on an upward trajectory. And so over time, the propaganda and the reality, the gap between these things is going to grow and grow and grow. And I think maybe we will start to see something that more and more like the Soviet Union in its last decades.
Yeah. I feel like we really need to get politicians that aren't 80 years old, that are stuck living in the past. I think that's a big part of the problem. Is someone like Trump is, his whole career was, his whole life was during that American exception period, post-World War II. And I think he's not able to adjust. Somebody like my age that was born after the collapse of the Soviet Union or right at the collapse, I think has a just completely different view of how the world works.
Yeah, I'm sure that's part of, there's going to be a generational change. That's a good point.
Yeah. Well, the thing that worries me, to be honest, about Trump is, the scariest thing that I saw was when he retweeted the Mike Huckabee a message that he sent to Trump before the bombing of Iran, just saying how, he survived that assassination and that this was divine intervention and God is expecting great things from you and to make the decisions that no normal person can make, that you can make. So and the fact that he retweeted it is, and we know how his ego, I think in his mind, possibly because that assassination was insane as well. So that's one of the things that just scares me. You have an old guy that maybe thinks he's here to do things that, nobody else could do, that God has given him this purpose. And if things start to get out of control, I don't want that kind of person behind the button for a nuclear launch. That does scare me a bit.
Yeah, no, it is. It is very disturbing. I've been thinking the same thing. That's right. I mean, he has shown a reluctance again to become directly, engaged in wars. Again, he likes things like assassinations, the assassination of Soleimani, or the operation that took out maybe they didn't take it out, but that attacked the nuclear facilities in Iran. That's the kind of thing that he goes for, and but maybe you could say the same thing about a nuclear. This is easy, I just press the button, this is, and this will solve the problem. I don't see that happening now, but I kind of painted a scenario where we could get to that point and he could be the kind of person that says, we can't lose, I'm a great man. We just have to be brave. Okay, let's launch 2 tactical nuclear warheads.
Right. I mean, he's very much a shoot from the hip kind of guy. We can kind of see it in his behavior with the tariffs, and also just the decision to bomb Iran. It's scary. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's right. It is scary. It is.
Well,
it looks like the neocons have really got their claws in him, and they're going to be pushing him down that dangerous road.
Right. Well, yeah, they do exactly. I mean, I showed you that clip from Lindsey Graham. Something else that he said, he has this bone-crushing sanction bills. He's got 85 co-sponsors, and he said, basically, this is a sledgehammer for Trump to go after Putin's economy and all those countries who prop up the Putin war machine. So this is kind of, I think we're not just going to be antagonizing, from what it sounds like, if we can believe Lindsey Graham, not just Russia, but it looks like we want to really piss off China. And this is just unbelievably stupid. But the way that they're talking and the way that Trump had that tweet about BRICS and said anybody that has any anti-American BRICS policy, which we don't know what that means.
Right.
Basically, if you're part of BRICS, we'll slap you with additional 10% tariffs. It almost sounds like Trump is wanting to go to war with BRICS, and Lindsey Graham's back there just rubbing his hands with glee. Yes, this is it. Is that what you think is happening? That's the path we've chosen? So much for America first?
Well, yeah, Trump would understand it as America first, but in the end, it caused us a great deal of damage. It would be a case of, we shooting ourselves in the foot, or as Viktor Orban put it, shooting ourselves in the lung. It would be very, very damaging to the American economy. Yeah, these bone-crushing sanctions, they're not actually sanctions that would be imposed on Russia. There's secondary sanctions, really tariffs, really, that would be imposed on any country that buys oil or uranium. Now, the funny thing is that, one of the few things that we're still buying from Russia, we, the United States, is uranium. This is, so I don't know if we're going to sanction ourselves.
Why would we buy that from Russia? Can we not make enriched uranium ourselves?
Well, no. We need actually the raw uranium that's mined, that's dug out of the ground. That we do need a certain supply of that, and then we buy it from Russia. I guess that's where we get the best quality and the best deal. So obviously, I think we'll carve out an exemption for ourselves, but it'll just infuriate every other country all the more. Say, okay, yeah, so you're not going to apply this to yourselves, but you're going to slap 500% or whatever, which is just ridiculous. It doesn't really matter if it's 100% or 500%. Either way, it's just shutting down trade. But the whole thing is absurd on so many levels. You're talking about China. China is the main buyer of Russian oil. But we had just actually pulled back from the abyss in our economic war with China. And this would just take us right to the abyss again. I mean, the Chinese are not going to just accept this. They're going to slap 100% or 500%, whatever it is, tariffs on our goods as well. And then we're back to where we were. The economy, the international economy was about to crash, and that's why they pulled back and they made some sort of deal, or they're still negotiating it, but they greatly reduced the tariffs. Now, this would just completely blow that those negotiations out of the water. The settlement would be gone, and we back to where we are, waging economic war again. And the thing is, so I don't think these countries are going to submit to that. You're talking about China and India, two very, very large countries, and they're proud and sovereign. Maybe India might, but it would be, very much to their detriment. They really have benefited from cheap Russian oil. It's been very, very good for them. And so this is something I think they've stated they're not going to go along with it. But, if they did, it would certainly hurt them. Now, let's just say, theoretically, okay, that these sanctions, these secondary sanctions, these tariffs are successful and nobody buys Russian oil. Well, what's going to happen? Russia is the second largest oil exporter in the world. That I think at least 12% of internationally traded oil is Russian exports. You take that off the market, that's going to have a huge impact. Now, it's going to be a lot more. It doesn't work like, okay, you remove 12% of the supply, the price goes up 12%. There's this whole issue of elasticity. If, in general, people need their gas, so they'll keep on buying it. The price will just keep on going up. So like a 12% reduction in supply means that the price, I don't know what it would go, it could easily double, triple, quadruple, up to the point where people are just forced to look for alternatives. Like, okay, I can't drive to work in my car. I'm going to have to carpool or take the bus. And people are generally reluctant to do that. So it has to really be painful before they make those changes. So the price is going to, if you actually got Russian oil off the international market, it would be very painful. It would be painful for the U.S. The U.S. is the world's largest oil producer, but it's also the world's largest oil consumer. And as a result, it's a net importer of oil. It does export some.
We're the largest oil producer?
Yeah, no, it's actually quite extraordinary, but we are. But because we're such a huge consumer of oil, I think we're the largest consumer of oil. We end up importing oil. We're a net importer. We do export some, but we import more than we export. So we're a net importer of oil. So the U.S. would certainly be affected. But like Europe is just totally dependent on imports. And they are actually consuming Russian oil, but it's Russian oil that passes through India. The Indians take it and then mix it with some other oil, refine it, and send it to Europe. So anyway, Europe would be greatly, obviously Russia would be hurt, China would be hurt, but Europe would be hurt too. I mean, and we would too. I mean, the price of oil would just shoot up on the international market. It would be huge.
So it looks like if we do this, we go to the abyss, but I imagine these countries will just ignore it, right? They're not going to stop, right?
Yeah, I think there's no question that China will. I think the others will too. I mean, that they just say, hey, we're sovereign countries and you can't do this to us. I think there's just been too much craziness. But there's no question the Chinese are just going to say, they've already, they've been there before. We remember they didn't blink the first time, and they're not going to blink again. And the thing is that, like, okay, you're going to try to shut down Chinese imports of Russian oil. Okay, well, we're once again in an economic war, and the Chinese have leverage over us. I mean, it's just they produce so many goods that we depend on. They're starting to get reports. Shelves are starting to empty in California. Or the container ships that are coming in at like the Long Beach port just don't have empty containers, so the truckers are being laid off because there's nothing. It was beginning to happen, and then that's when the U.S. blinked and negotiated this new deal with China. So the Chinese know. And then another thing was going on is that, again, China controls rare earths. The vast majority of rare earth elements are produced in China. They're mined there and refined and sold by the Chinese, and are all kinds of industries, including the auto industry, not to mention the defense industry, is really dependent on those. And so they just, they have enormous leverage over us. It's just crazy. It's amazing to me that Lindsey Graham can talk like this, that he could be so abysmally ignorant. Now, Trump has insisted on having some control over how these so-called bone-crushing sanctions would be imposed. It wouldn't be at an automatic 500%. It would be like 0 to 500%. So maybe he'll impose another 50% on China. But that's still good. I don't know. Whatever. It doesn't make any sense. He's already slapping all these tariffs on willy-nilly on all kinds of countries. And this will just be on top of that. And we're going to be in a huge economic mess. It seems like interestingly, the markets are starting to show a response. So far, they haven't. I think they almost just can't believe it's true. But we are getting back to where we were just a couple months ago when we're on the verge of an economic crash. And I think we're going to see real turbulence, especially if these so-called bone-crushing sanctions are passed.
Is that maybe a good thing if we pass these bone-crushing sanctions? Because I feel like if we go to war with BRICS, we're talking about in not even causing, let's say, the financial collapse, but just expediting it, because it's going to happen no matter what. But if I'd rather us go to war with BRICS and cause this economic collapse, because I feel like it needs to happen. We need this financial collapse. We need a reset. That the system's broken. But the alternative is I don't want to go to war with Russia or China, because that's a worse cliff to go over. So it feels like, we're heading off the cliff. Is this the better cliff to fall off of? And if we do this, then that might cause the end of the empire without us having to drop nukes or go to war. So.
Well, potentially. It certainly is the better cliff to fall off of. I mean, we fall off that cliff and we can pick ourselves up and go on and, hopefully reform. It is, I agree, the better cliff to fall off. But there's no guarantee that an economic disaster will prevent a military disaster.
Yeah, maybe it'll be the cause.
Yeah, it even could be. It could just lead to even more deranged thinking at the top.
Right. Well, yeah, there's no good ways out. I'm always trying to find a way out of this mess. And maybe financial collapse might be our way out.
Yeah, maybe that would be the wake up call. Hey, we've gone down the wrong road, and then the start of real reform. It's not impossible. Yeah. Maybe that's. I think. Right. There has to be some kind of true crisis for there to be a real change in policy. I mean, just look at the people in charge. And, by and large, there are rumblings of discontent among, the various electorates in Europe and in the U.S. But still, they really have failed to throw the bums out. But maybe a true crisis would lead to that. Now, we may even end up with people who are even crazier, but there's a chance that we could have people who, finally have a firm grip of reality and could take us out of this mess. So, I don't want to say that's impossible. It could happen.
All right, so fingers crossed for a crisis. Is that what we're
Sure.
doing? Okay. Well, do you see any off ramps for either of these conflicts? With Ukraine or with Iran?
Not really. I mean, we did have one with Iran before we did what we did. There's no reason why we could not have negotiated a very sensible and effective settlement, a solution to the so-called, Iran nuclear program. Now, even that was not necessary. Again, Iran's nuclear program is under, inspection, very, very intensive inspection by the
Right, actually,
it was. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. So those inspections, like Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan's, the ones that we hit, those
Yeah.
were all under inspection.
Yeah.
There were IEA
Yeah.
inspectors that'd be on the ground, and they
Yeah,
had
well,
access. Obviously not when it
hit,
happened,
yeah.
but
Right.
but they were there and they had
Oh, yeah.
full access to everything.
Yeah, right,
And
right,
so
right.
you don't think that's what we could have just talked to those guys to see
Yeah,
how
right.
things
Well,
would go?
exactly. I mean, that's the thing. It was a fully, inspected program, and under more intensive inspection, like 3 times more than the average. It, I think it was like 21% of resources of the IAEA were devoted to Iran, when it was only 7% of the nuclear facilities. And
We had cameras in there, right?
Yeah.
It's-
And the JCPOA took it even farther, but then Trump tore that up. Right. So it's just like you had a solution. You say, well, the JCPOA was going to expire. Well, the thing to do is renegotiate it. That you already have everything worked out. You can just negotiate renewal. And don't tell me that Pezeshkian wouldn't have. Of course he would. He was, so very naive. He probably would have offered them even more than they had before. But we blew it. We tore up the agreement, and then what we did, of course, just a few weeks ago, we attacked them in the middle of negotiations. Now the IAEA is out of there, and the Iranians almost would be crazy to negotiate with us again. So I don't see a solution. There was one. We had one, for our taking right there. We could have had this JCPOA 2. And, but unfortunately, Trump listened to the wrong people. And there were always those Israel firsters and Iran war hawks were around him, and they convinced him to do what he did. And now I don't see a solution to it, very sadly. I mean, I really don't. And then with Ukraine, it's just, that was always going to be a lot harder. We argued about how the U.S. could have extricated itself if it just really dealt with the reality, and laid the groundwork, made a firm position. This war was a mistake. Ukraine, you're just going to have to accept your losses. But we couldn't do that. That was going to be politically difficult, as always. But maybe when the new administration had a lot of political capital, it could have gone in there real hard and taken a true America First position. And I think it would have been, the political elite would have gone crazy. And, they did over some of the moves in that direction. But the people, Trump's base, they would have been happy with it. Yeah, let's just forget about Ukraine. We don't need to do that. It's a European problem, if they want to. And then pulling out, that really would put the huge amount of pressure on the Ukrainians to go to the negotiating table. And then maybe, probably not right away, but at some point, they actually would just say, okay, yeah, we just have to accept reality. But we didn't do that. We had these unrealistic expectations that I was talking about. And so we just dragged on and on. And now we're in a position where it's just become very, very difficult, to walk away. We failed to change the narrative. The narrative is still Russian aggression that must be stopped, brave Ukraine. And here we are, today Trump is going to give a speech about where he's going to declare himself to be the new Biden when it comes to Ukraine.
Oh, good Lord. I wonder what they told Trump to make him think that we got this. You can do you Trump. You can take on the whole world. Is it these? I'm sure they have to present some plan. I mean, I can see how if he was just listening to Israeli intelligence and Netanyahu on this Iran thing and Mike Huckabee, Mark Levine, just saying, yeah, this really elaborate scheme that we got this. So it just makes me feel like maybe there's some other plan that he's being fed. That's why he's ready to. Okay, yeah, we got this. We can go down this war. Well,
Yeah.
one thing that I'm wondering if this will be a player, we mentioned it before, and I've been hearing about it more, is Azerbaijan being used as a proxy in both of these conflicts. I want to say Colonel Douglas McGregor was saying that the possibility of Azerbaijan invading like northwest Iran. And I think it was Alistair Crook I heard say something about Azerbaijan criminal organizations being potentially behind some of the parts of Operation Spiderweb that were used to carry it out, that the Ukrainians employed Azerbaijani criminal organizations. I don't know if these are true, but just some things I've heard. I don't know if that's potentially a player, and maybe that's like, don't worry, Trump, we got a secret plan. I don't know, but it's like, okay, Azerbaijan against Russia or Iran, like it's a tiny country.
Those are all possibilities. I think like in the case of Azerbaijan, it's like Turkey. Turkey doesn't really, Turkey's in NATO, but Turkey is Turkey, and they do have their own ambitions. Sometimes I think we make the mistake because we're looking at the larger geopolitical chessboard that we always think it has to be a white piece or a black piece, and I think like in the case of Turkey and Azerbaijan, that they actually are close allies in some ways. They've been described as joined at the hip. They're gray pieces. They're their own pieces, and sometimes they play with one side and sometimes with the other. And then, particularly in the case of Azerbaijan, they're just plain outright criminal organizations that have a huge degree of influence. And I've heard different arguments. I found actually in this case, like Alexander Mercouris's arguments, and he's apparently has sources in Azerbaijan, who said, yeah, it's really the criminal organizations that are behind this. It's when the Russian government started cracking down on their networks in Russia. They're furious, and they have so much pull. There's actually a great deal of criminal organization influence in the Azerbaijani government. That's really what moved the Azerbaijani government to do what they did, to arrest the journalists and then just seize random citizens and Russian citizens and beat them up. Now, there certainly can be a geopolitical aspect to it. It just this happens all the time. One side or the other can kind of can use one of these players, like Turkey and like Turkey and Azerbaijan. Turkey sometimes works for the NATO side. Sometimes it helps out the Russians. And right now, Azerbaijan is obviously greatly angering the Russians. It looks like the Russians actually really aren't backing down on this. They've gone ahead with the crackdowns. They haven't stopped cracking down on Azerbaijani criminal networks in Russia. And one thing that I don't think it got much coverage, but one thing that the Azerbaijanis did is that like they held up a shipment of, I believe it was onions, from Russia, and they came up with this ridiculous excuse why they couldn't accept the onions. They're trying to put some sort of economic pressure on the Russians. Now the Russians have come back and have seized peaches and all kinds of things. They say, well, this looks like it violates rule number 5036B, and so they're holding it up. And in the end, I think Russia can actually do more damage, and Azerbaijan probably will have to back down. Now, as for a cooperation between Azerbaijan and Israel, well, that's real. There's this military cooperation. Now, I don't know that they want to actually go so far as to directly attack Iran. That would be very risky. The Iranians Iran is a much bigger country, but who knows? So,
do you think it's pretty safe to say that the CIA and Mossad are funding these criminal organizations for their own benefit to antagonize Russia or Iran?
It's certainly possible. It's very, very possible. There's, this kind of thing happens all the time. Just like, the CIA and Mossad work with Al Qaeda, secretly.
Yeah, we like
They find
terrorist organizations and criminal organizations because we can because you can pay them with buy them off with guns and money. It's just
right.
like we give you the weapons.
Yeah.
They want
These
that
people,
stuff.
right? These people, obviously, just are generally just don't have principles. They don't. They're interested in
They're criminals.
making money. Yeah. Or in the case of Al Qaeda, they're really fixated on like killing Shia. That's the kind of thing. And it's just like, okay, yeah, we don't like the Israelis. We hate almost everybody, but we hate the Shia more, so we'll work with the Israelis. That's what that's what happens.
Yeah, that makes me think about how strong of a grip does al-Jawlani have on Syria? Is his position tenuous?
I think it is. I don't think he has much of a grip at all. It's not a whole lot of information is coming out of Syria, but whatever comes out, whatever I see is bad. And you do get this general impression of chaos. There's not so much like an organized, top-down, well, you could say we're repression, certain kinds of laws that put in effect that clearly are, favor the Sunnis over other groups, but not in general, not outright seizure of properties or mass killings or anything. Those are not government sponsored, but there are these people running around with guns. And what was it, like 2 months ago or so, that there were those massacres in Western Syria. Mostly there were Shia Alawites and in Christians there, mostly Alawites. Hundreds were killed, and the government, promised to investigate whatever, but nothing's happened. Nobody's been charged. Now, that either happened just, these people just took these gangs took the initiative, these militias, without informing the government, or maybe they told the government, and the government said, sure, it's just it's one or the other. There's just a lot of these militias are clearly, either they're acting on their own, there's just a lack of control, or they're working in cahoots with the government. And there's maybe the government likes to maintain a certain amount of plausible deniability.
So do you think that al-Jawlani, or what's he being called now?
Al-Shara.
Al-Shara, is he going to be, do you think that he will probably be overthrown in the not too distant future? And if he does, is there any chance, do people want Assad back? I feel like he kind of lost the respect of most of the world in Syria, right. Syrians.
Yeah, no, right. In the end, right, he failed to protect them. I think they would still, I don't know. It just looks very, very grim from Syria. I don't think Syria is ever going to be put back together again.
No.
The Israeli policy of fragmentation and general weakening really seems to have succeeded in Syria. And there is talk that there will be some kind of peace deal between the Israeli government and al-Jawlani or al-Shara. And that would include a recognition of
the
Golan Heights, of Israeli ownership of the Golan Heights, and it would also accept certain like buffer zones, that Syrian military units would not be allowed into certain areas in southern Syria, and so essentially the Israelis would maintain a certain, indirect control over those areas.
Israel's just caused so much destruction for the people in the Middle East. I just feel bad for everybody in the Middle East. They're just living there, and we just plop this ethno-supremacist state that wants to expand forever.
They couldn't have done it, the Israelis. We have to. There is some blame to be apportioned to the people there, not to the majority of people, but to these Sunni extremists who are just so fixated again on killing or defeating their sectarian enemies there that they cooperate with Israel. That's what we've seen in Syria, and we've seen in other places as well. And that gives, Israel exploits that fact, and so they work together with these forces.
Do you think Trump has he been showing any signs of regret for bombing Iran?
No.
And the whole, I mean, I just got to think he's got to be like, man, this did not work out. I messed up,
I don't think he
like,
thinks that way. I don't think he's.
you don't think?
Yeah, I think he's incapable of really admitting something like that. I just don't think so. It's
I
still
feel
the
like
most
he
awesome
has to
thing.
feel. It was just such
Right.
I mean, I think that was such a horrible move. The way that it was done during the negotiations, just
Yeah,
destroying
right,
any idea of the U.S. being a good
right.
guy. Was just
Yeah, no,
evaporated at
it
that
was
point.
disastrous. I mean, again, it's just like there was a solution waiting for you. You could have taken it, and now it's gone. There's just no solution now. It's
Right. And they got the crazy thing. They just had to play it off as a win, but it's just going to come back by. It's like you have no eyes on the situation now. You had all these cameras, inspectors on the
right.
ground that have access to everything. Now you got
Yeah,
nothing, and now it's like
right,
now who knows? And then now they might be building a nuke.
right.
Uh, what a mess. What
Yeah,
our decision making is just it's so bad. It's so
yeah,
bad here. Our federal
yeah.
government is just such a joke, and I think
Right,
that in itself is just that's the a death knell. I think nail in the coffin for the U.S. empire, just in itself. Just
right.
the fact that everybody can see, just like, yeah, your country is insane. Your leadership, your system sucks. This is what it
Yeah.
does. Like
Yeah, well, more and more people are seeing that. I mean, it's just like in the case of Iran's nuclear program. It's not, this was the kind of the culmination. It was one terrible decision on top of another. And there's been a series of terrible decisions that have led us to where we are. Originally going back to the 1980s, the Islamic Republic had inherited this nuclear program from the previous regime, from the Shah, and um, and at first they didn't do much with it, and then they said, yeah, we need this. This is something. Billions of dollars have already been invested. This would be good for us to have. Let's start it up. But what we'll do is we'll just buy the enriched uranium. You can actually get in the form of like fuel rods, which can't be further enriched. That's 3.7%, and power these nuclear reactors. But the U.S. actually just shut that down. So it was because the U.S. and Israel and other powers prevented them from just doing this that they went for enrichment. Now enrichment is completely legal, but then that raised all these red flags, all this this alarm. So it's just like it's one thing after the other. And it's a very similar thing happened actually in North Korea. We had a deal with the North Koreans. We actually did that. We will provide, some of this nuclear technology to you and help you run it, but at the same time make sure that you don't, enrich too high and create nuclear weapons. And the North Koreans agreed to it. They actually dismantled the facilities that they had, and then the U.S. reneged on the deal. What happens is I think you have some people that are smart and well-intentioned within the U.S. government, and they understand what's going on, and they help to work out these deals. But then you have these crazies that are always in the wing, and they're just trying to do what they can to torpedo or sabotage these things, and so we end up in these terrible outcomes. The John Bolton, for example, in the case of North Korea, but then we have there are plenty of suspects in the case of Iran.
yeah, we're making all these consecutive bad decisions. I mean, in the case of Iran, I mean, we have to point the finger at Israel. This is the only reason we're making these bad decisions, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say the only decision. I think it is them. They are the main driver. It clearly have been for decades. They have had this obsession. Remember, I think it was the chief editor of Middle East
Middle East
Spectator,
Eye
or
or Spectre, I don't know.
yeah. But anyway, he was saying like he actually met Netanyahu in the early 2000s, and the first thing that Netanyahu told him is we have to get Iran. We have to. That's what he would tell a lot of people. Just first off, so this is something that goes back. There's been this steady pressure from Israel. So yeah, I think they're the main driver of it. But there also always have been Americans that have been obsessed with bringing down the regime in Iran, even independent of Israel. So there is another element there. Like going back when the Shah was overthrown, there was a real shock to the Americans. He was a really important part of their their role in the Middle East. This is where this was a great power, as a way that they controlled the region, was through him. They lost him, and so it's like after that, they say we got to get, these people are going to resist us. We have to get somebody back in there who cooperates with us. So there is a kind of a pure, more geopolitical, you could even call it America first of some kind, ideology behind it. But yeah, it seems like the passion, the real extreme pressure has been coming from the Israel firsters.
It's the only good thing I could say is that it's becoming more and more apparent to people that a lot of this is coming from Israel, and Israel's to blame for a lot of the death and destruction and our involvement in the Middle East. So hopefully we continue to see that trend grow, and there could be some real change. I just wonder at what point, when will that happen?
Yeah.
It takes a while.
Right. Maybe I'm too pessimistic, because I've just seen this, the way things are. It was the way things have been for decades and decades. But, every order falls, and sometimes these established way of doing things can collapse very, very quickly. We may be surprised.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, let's end it there, Dad.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.